certainly a historic day.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Taco Comfort Solutions.
So this will be our last original broadcast for 2019. New shows will return after a couple of week hiatus on January 6th, a Monday night, to start the first full week. So Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy New Year to all of you. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, you will see shows, this notion of best of. Well, I never bought into that on television or radio, but highlight programs. I mean, smart shows, shows that are less today issue focused and more broad spectrum will air over the course of the 2 weeks, and things you probably didn't catch or may not have caught. Remember, any show that you ever miss is on WPRI.com and FoxProvidence.com the night that we put it up on the air. But you can always check in over the course of the next 2 weeks for programs that I think would be a broad interest, both on issues of Washington and here at home. So with no further ado, welcome aboard. Thank you for tuning in. My friend Joe Fleming. Fleming is the, I got a thing going on. You know what, I thought I beat this cold, but it has a kicker to it. So for those of you who've had this 2 week thing, it kicks back. Don't get cocky about it. But here's the headline from this morning. And let me just let the network review what we have here.
House will be in order.
Lawmakers in the House of Representatives began the morning going over the procedures for how they'll debate articles of impeachment against President Trump. The House will vote on the two articles back to back. Article 1 is abuse of power. Article 2, obstruction of Congress.
If a president undermining our national security and using the federal government for his own selfish personal gain is not impeachable conduct, then, Madam Speaker, I don't know what is.
Democrats have been searching for a reason to impeach President Trump since the day he was elected.
Democrats say the president abused his power by pressuring Ukraine to announce an investigation into his political rival, Joe Biden, and then obstructed Congress by blocking White House officials from complying with the House inquiry. Before lawmakers vote, they'll have 6 hours of debate divided equally between Democrats and Republicans. Possible procedural motions could add hours to that time frame. In a tweet this morning, President Trump asked, "Can you believe that I will be impeached today by the radical left, do-nothing Democrats, and I did nothing wrong?" It comes after he sent a scathing letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying, "You have cheapened the importance of the very ugly word impeachment," adding that more due process was afforded to those accused in the Salem witch trials.
Other presidents in the future, unless they do something about this, other presidents are going to have to live with this.
Pelosi responded, calling the president's letter really sick. The president said he will not be watching today's impeachment vote, and he looks forward to the trial in the Republican-controlled Senate.
I wish that Nancy Pelosi had said that the letter was unfortunate versus sick. Joe, because I think she's allowed herself to get caught up in his game.
Yeah. You want to stay above his game. You want to be very professional, and you don't want to stoop down to his level.
Yeah, and I think by and large, she has impressed me with her leadership and with her stand-up attitude. She may be one of the lone Democrats in this country who's got the intestinal fortitude to match Donald Trump's tenacity, being diplomatic. By the way, welcome.
Thank you.
Happy holidays to you.
Happy holidays.
I rather than getting immersed in polling data right now, you're a guy who's a great American, a longtime citizen, a viewer of politics, a poller of the people. How are you feeling today, just about things?
As far as the impeachment goes?
Well, just it. And I know you tend to go, let me go to the data, let me tell you what the data is. You don't often share your heart, your soul, because you're not asked to. But what are you feeling?
I'm feeling like it's a two-way street. We have an economy going very well, stock market up, things going very well. At the same time, we have a president who's going to be impeached today. So I'm sort of like in cross here. You like the way things are going in some parts of the economy, and we have no new wars, things like that. but at the same time we see a president who's being impeached. So I'm sort of torn between the two of them.
Polling data in general never lends toward an inclination for impeachment.
No.
People don't want it. They don't want it. And you got to be careful when you work in media, where the story, when it heightens, adds to attention, adds to your game on. You have to, when there's nothing going on, media is like blah, 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 blah. So it's like a firefighter rushes to a fire, media rushes to a political fire.
Oh, no question about that.
Or God forbid, something more tragic. You got to take a step away and realize that everyday Americans, of which we have to remember we are, don't want this aggravation.
No.
You build from a place of they don't want this. They don't get excited about this.
When Richard Nixon was going to be impeached, they weren't excited to the very end, when more evidence came out and the tapes came out.
Excited or convinced? I mean, excited.
Well, convinced that there was a problem.
Right.
Once the tapes came out, they saw he was actually doing the cover-up, and then everything turned on Richard Nixon, and he resigned before he was impeached. But nowadays, I think what we're seeing with social media, I think people really, okay, the impeachments are going on. They're not paying that much attention anymore to it. It's been going on for a little while. They're going through the motions. I think most people in the country agree he will be impeached and he will not be convicted. The same thing that happened to Bill Clinton. So I mean, people say, okay, it's politics. I'm tired of politics. Let me go on with my life.
Yeah. It's more than politics, but it's wrapped deeply in politics.
Right.
Meaning there's a substantive debate here about the president's act and behavior. And it's in the box. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever done this at the holidays or, can't remind me. I'm sure everyone's done this. You surprise somebody with what is a relatively small gift,
right?
But you wrap it in a big box.
Big box, right?
And you may go box, 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 and inside is a relatively small
thing,
gift.
right?
There's an act here that is foundational to this impeachment, but most people see it in a big box of politics,
right?
And they have to unravel. And the more I've had everyday conversations with even family members, they're in the big box.
I think that's what most of the country is.
They're in the big box. And I was thinking today, I recently said on the air, I don't know if I've said here, that I would have voted no on impeachment, whether I was a Democrat or a Republican congressman. I'm an independent, unaffiliated voter. But I would have voted no simply because I don't think enough diligence was done, not to convince me, but to convince deep-rooted opposition that there's a story in that box that they cannot ignore. And that may have been despite Congress's unlimited authority to subpoena the executive branch, affirming that in the courts, forcing Donald Trump's witnesses to the table, calling his bluff on that. The problem they saw, of course, was running into the election.
Right. You go to court, it's going to take a long time. I mean, people were saying that if they were going to impeach Donald Trump, it was going to take 12 to 18 months to do it. So people thought they wouldn't move with the impeachment. But Nancy Pelosi has really speeded it up to the point now it was done in a few months.
I'm wondering about the wisdom of that, Joe.
Well, it could backfire on the Democrats. Dan, there's no question at all, because we're going to get over this impeachment in the next month or so. By the end of January, the trial should be over. More than likely, unless something drastic happens, Donald Trump will not be convicted, and the impeachment will be behind him, and we'll be into full swing election mode.
This idea, and I subscribe to it, so I'm not going to be a hypocrite here. But as I was moving along, I was wondering whether it was true. And the idea was that you can't run an impeachment and an election campaign at the same time. Well, they passed the replacement for NAFTA in the middle of it. There are other things that they could have done. I think they got themselves convinced that two things couldn't be done at once, and I'm wondering why not. Because if time had played out for the judges to affirm that the inner circle of the president had to come to testify, given more time for the story to come out, Rudy Giuliani to shoot his mouth off like he did just this week to the New Yorker, and then reaffirming to Fox that, in fact, yeah, he was gunning for Maria Yovanovitch, the Ukrainian ambassador. The case didn't mature, not for the satisfaction of those who were convinced, but for those who were not convinced.
Right, and that's the problem the Democrats have had. They have not been able to convince enough of people in this country that he should be impeached. That number sits around 50%, 47%. They needed to get that number up to like 58, 60%. I think we talked about that once before on the show.
Right.
They never got that number to move because I don't think they had a strong enough case to get those voters to move off the idea that the president should not be impeached. They just could not move those numbers. And you're right, Dan, if they stretched it out over more months, they might be able to get the courts to make some rulings in their favor and get witnesses that they really need to really solidify the case. But Nancy Pelosi made a political decision, I think, to make it in a shorter period of time.
And Democrats, you know, there were a handful of Democrats who were talking impeachment from day one.
Right.
That is undeniable.
No question.
And I think they did their party and the country a disservice by their disgust for Donald Trump morphing into the impeachable category. I'm talking even pre-Mueller.
Yes. No, I agree. I think from day one there were some Democrats who wanted him impeached no matter what. And I think what happened was when the Mueller report didn't give them what they want, they got the Ukraine and they pushed that even harder. So, I mean, I think they were always looking for something on Donald Trump. There's no question about that. And I think what happened was as time went on, Nancy Pelosi was trying to basically do a tightrope, but I think she saw the caucus turning more towards impeachment, and she basically agreed to go with it. And again, she wanted to keep it in a shorter period of time.
That the Ukrainian call was okay,
Right.
gotcha. I just wonder, in a vacuum, you know, does the Ukrainian call measure up? I don't think so.
I'm not sure either. I agree with you there. I'm really not sure.
Take the Republicans, take the worry about Russians away, take the worry about the Mueller report away, which is impossible to do. But not unlike Buddy Cianci got arrested, right?
Right.
Who was found not guilty of the predicate counts against him. Went to prison for near 5 years
Right.
because of his overarching
Right,
responsibility.
the RICO Act.
There's no RICO Act to
No.
play here. But that's really what the Democrats are selling. It's a foundational predicate
Correct.
that you can debate is impeachable or not, but it's his overall.
Yeah, if they had a witness, for example, let's say John Bolton testified, and Bolton said, yes, I heard the president say that we're doing this to get X, Y, and Z, then it will be a whole different story.
And there's a guy who's telegraphed that he doesn't want to come in, but, you know, if you force me to, I will.
Right.
Well, it would have taken a few months to force him to.
And I think that's a plan the Democrats may have wanted to go with. But again, for some reason, they do not want to bring this into the election.
All right, when we come back, we'll talk about some of the data, or as we say in Rhode Island, the data. Stay with us. Well, and of course, you know, impeach him or not, this president is belligerent. If any, it doesn't matter who. In fact, there are moments where he's tweeted in the last couple of weeks that, you know, Fox has actually joined the ranks of CNN and
Right.
MSNBC, which ought to give the base pause that nothing that comes up against
Right.
him or nothing that shows that he's not the king of the hill is legitimate. I don't know whether that will ever wear down.
Well, with Donald Trump, there's two rules. Rule number one, I'm always right. Rule number two, when I'm wrong, refer to rule number one.
Got it. So let me throw a second poll up, then we'll have a good conversation, because I think Joe and I found some disagreement during the break, which is good for the show. That second Quinnipiac poll, Kev, if you can put that up real quick, or at least a headline that reflects on it. So Joe Biden continues to lead the league here.
Right.
In terms of the Democratic field.
Correct.
You told me during the break that you think Donald Trump's biggest worry is Joe Biden.
I do.
Okay, explain to me why.
Well, because I think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, the other two people that are polling fairly well, are so liberal, they're not going to play in the Midwest.
By
They're
the
not
way,
going to play.
I'm sorry, this is the Emerson poll there.
Right.
We have two sets, but we'll use the Emerson data because it's the same thing. You can see Biden leading the league here significantly.
They're not going to play in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Arizona, Michigan. I don't think those people will play well there, Warren and Sanders. And I think that's going to make it easier for Donald Trump to win. Joe Biden will play fairly well in those places. We saw in a New York Times survey of the swing states so about a month ago that the person who does the best in those states is Biden. However, I got to say, the president isn't doing bad. He's within 3 or 4 points in all those states. But when you put Sanders and Warren in there, he's actually winning those states. So I really think Biden has the best chance because I think he can draw voters that Warren and Sanders cannot draw.
Yeah, okay. Well, that tells me that Donald Trump will be reelected because Joe Biden is damaged goods. I agree with you, by the way.
Yep.
His moderate Democratic stance is much more playable in the swing states, no doubt. Elizabeth Warren is kidding herself in this
Yep.
mix. Bernie Sanders has had his day, and the two of them are doing a disservice to the Democratic Party, or the notion that Donald Trump's got to go no matter what, because they will stand in the way of that happening should they win the nomination. There's
Right.
no doubt in my mind.
Right,
The
but
visceral hatred, unfortunately, for liberal politics by everyday Americans is profound. At least our
right.
age.
Yes. Yes.
Not the younger people,
No.
but they're not so energized,
No, they're not.
right?
No, I agree with you. They're not energized. People our age are the ones who are out there voting. They're the ones the politicians are very concerned
Joe,
about.
don't you think the Hunter Biden part of this whole thing is a drag on Joe Biden when he gets free? You know, when he frees up and wins the nomination, having to answer for that in the kind of, machine gun battle that's going to go on rhetorically, of course,
there's no
back and
question.
forth. I don't know how he survives it because he's got answers to give and they have not been sufficient.
Well, I think first of all, that's going to basically energize Trump's base. He's going to use that to keep his base up there. The question is, the people who don't like Donald Trump right now, who are saying, well, I don't like him, but I want to see what the Democrats offer. If it's a Warren or a Sanders, they're going to say, I'm going with Donald Trump. If it's a Biden, they might listen, and then he can try to defend himself.
But you don't think that being dragged into this mud, I think this whole impeachment inquiry has been sacrificial for Joe Biden in the long run. You don't think so?
No, I think the impeachment inquiry
You
is
think
really...
people will forget about the data of the story, the details of the story?
I think
in the
Biden
middle
has
of
to explain
2020?
it. He has to explain it. There's no question what happened there, what's going on.
Can he put it away?
He might be able to because Donald Trump keeps changing what he's talking about a lot of times. I mean, if Trump stays on it, it might help. The question is, can Trump expand it from his base, or does he keep it just with his base? That's the big question.
Well, if his base is 35 to 40%,
Right.
and 50% of the country doesn't want impeachment,
Right.
is that 10 to 15% that doesn't want impeachment, you think they're fungible?
I think I've seen polling data that says 54% of the voters do not want to re-elect Donald Trump. So I mean, the people are willing to go away from Donald Trump. He's going at 42%. That seems to be his base right now.
They want the privilege of voting him out.
I think they do, if they have the right person. If the right person isn't there, they're not going to vote him out. Because think about it. If this was any other president who basically stayed focused on what he's doing and talked about wages, talked about jobs, talked about the stock market, talked about unemployment, 6 million new jobs, do you think the Democrats would have a chance in this race? Donald Trump's keeping them in this race. And the impeachment, Donald Trump is so much talking about the impeachment, he's not talking about these other things, all the good things that he's done over the 3 years, because he's so focused on impeachment. So the Democrats don't have
Well,
to
he
deal
ran
with
some
this.
of it in his letter. I mean, the letter is what the letter is.
He's venting.
Well, you see his speech in every arena
Right.
in that letter. You
Right.
might as well just read the letter going along. So some of the polling data also has Donald Trump losing to multiple candidates in
Right.
the Democratic Party. We'll talk about the veracity of that when we come back. Stay with us. Look, these pollster guys have all sorts of ways of trying to figure this whole thing out, and by and large, they're still on it and need to be respected. Although, in general, don't you think whatever Trump bias, wrong word, whatever Trump deficit that we find in a poll, you got to add back a handful of points based on the last exercise?
Well,
Yes or no?
no. Because in 2016, the national polls had it right. They had Hillary Clinton winning the election by about 3%. And she did win the election by 3%. She defeated Donald Trump 66 million votes to 63 million votes. It was in the states themselves, the electoral colleges, where the pollsters had it wrong. In key states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. but the national polling had it pretty accurate.
So we're going to stop polling the country, or we're going to have less polls about the country, and we're going to have a half a dozen polls in swing states that will matter.
I think that's more important than the national polls, because the national polls, you might see Donald Trump, we saw some recently, he's down by 6, 7 points to a number of these Democrats. But the question is the swing states, how is he doing there? We know Donald Trump's not going to win Massachusetts, he's not going to win Rhode Island, he's not going to win New York. But in the swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, how is he playing there?
Gender poll is fascinating.
Yes.
Absolutely fascinating. For men, Donald Trump beats everybody.
Correct. And the Fox poll has the same thing.
Women, Donald Trump gets clobbered by a couple of extra points on the margin.
Yes.
By everybody.
And the Fox poll has the same exact thing.
Well, so can a cad stop being a cad? I don't know.
I don't see where Donald Trump's going to gain much among the females. He has to keep building among white males. That's where his strength was 4 years ago. He has to do the exact same thing, keep building among white males. The female vote is not strong for him. It wasn't 4 years ago. It's not going to be this year either. We even saw in Rhode Island in the governor's race 3 years ago, last year I should say. Gina Raimondo had a big lead among female voters. Alan Fung for most of the time was running pretty even or ahead among males. But Gina's lead among females was about 13 to 15 points.
Who gets what party? What will the difference be between 16 and 20 in terms of the female vote in the country? You think there's an energized female gender turnout?
Personally, I think there might be, because the number of females that turned off with Donald Trump. But again, that remains to be seen. Keep in mind, the election's 11 months away.
Yeah.
That's a long time, Dan, in this arena. And these polls at this point don't mean that much.
In fact, it's never been longer, has it?
No, I don't
Based
think
on the
so.
way the cycles move
Oh, yes.
and Donald Trump's giant sucking sound on the
Right.
news cycle.
There's no question. And again, as I was just saying, these polls mean very little right now. People's opinions are going to change a great deal. If once this impeachment is done, if Donald Trump can stay focused and talk about the things that have happened, like the stock market, the new jobs, low unemployment, that could really help him out in those swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. That could be a big plus for him if Donald Trump can stay focused. I don't know if he can.
I don't know. There's something that tells me the Democrats just don't have anybody yet. And I don't think I just don't think Joe Biden is the guy to put it over the top. But who knows?
Well, I mean, those are the candidates right now. I don't see anybody else really coming in.
Bloomberg buying his way in.
I don't think that's going. He's up 4 or 5% of most of the polls, and that was what $100 million he spent. And he's not in a lot of the early states. I think once we get through Iowa and New Hampshire, the candidate's going to start to drop out. It's going to get smaller and smaller. So we'll see after the first 4 for sure what there is left. And then there's a Super Tuesday, March 3rd. That's going to be a key day.
Well, we only have 10 seconds here. We'll have to have some significant polling to talk about when the Senate impeachment trial is over.
Yes.
That will be the default place
Yes.
to start, correct?
I would think so.
All right.
I would think so.
All right. Merry Christmas, man.
Merry
Thank
Christmas.
you. All right. So final word and we can back. Stay with us. I'll tell you, my Christmas, the cold makes me talk like Elmer Fudd, silly wabbit. The Christmas wish I have for you and for all of us is that we can actually take a break from this. I've already had a couple of family conversations that I've wisely just let sit where they are. Hopefully the Hanukkah and Christmas celebrations and the joy of a new year will supersede the tension. That's my wish for you. Enjoy it. We'll see you with new shows beginning January 6th. Happy New Year.